heading into week 4 of the fantasy football season. Here's a few quarterbacks I looked at on the waiver wire this week. The first guy, Jared Goff, the Detroit Lions. So Goff, he was on the waiver wire list last week in week 3. And now heading into week 4 here, he's a guy that didn't have the greatest of ball games in week 3 versus the Minnesota Vikings. 277 pass yards, a touchdown, interception, and 8 rush yards. But right here in week 4, he's got a good home game matchup versus the Seattle Seahawks. And we know their secondary gives up a lot of yards and vulnerable to a lot of yards. Marcus Mariota had a decent ball game versus them as well with 18 fantasy points. He's Mariota versus this defense. And right here, Jared Goff, he's got some good weapons. And at home, obviously, he's been a better player so far this season than the one road game he's had. Week 1 versus Philly, 215 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, and 9 rush yards. And week 2 versus the Commanders, 256 pass yards, 4 touchdowns in that one. So right here, good matchup in week 4. I know it wasn't the greatest of games in week 3, but he just plays better at home. He's got a true number 1 wide receiver right now in Amon-Ra Brown, even though we saw he was banged up in the week 3 ball game. But I think Goff is a replacement for someone who's not getting the job done. Case may be if you stream quarterbacks or whatever. I think Goff still could put up good numbers in week 4 versus Seattle. And he's a guy I would pick up, available right now in 55% of fantasy leagues. Next quarterback's Trevor Lawrence of the Jacksonville Jaguars. So Lawrence, he's not available in many fantasy leagues here. Only available in about a little over 40% of leagues here. But Lawrence, so far, he's looked way better this season in the first 3 games than he has all of last season, pretty much. Week 1 at Washington, 275 pass yards, a touchdown, and 4 rush yards. In week 2 versus Indianapolis, 235, 2 touchdowns, 11 rush yards. In week 3 at the Chargers, he had a monster ball game and one of the better ball games in his career in the first year and change here. 262 pass yards, 3 touchdowns, and 7 rush yards with a 2-point conversion. So right here, Trevor Lawrence, he's getting the job done right now for this Jaguar team. He was the number 1 pick in last season's NFL draft for a reason. And you could see how he could spread the ball out and get it to his weapons. So right now, I know he's got a tough matchup in week 4 versus the Philadelphia Eagles. But Lawrence, he has poise in the pocket. We know he's a guy that's barely lost any games in his high school and college career. And so far, this Jacksonville team surprising everyone, 2-1 in the early going. Yeah, I don't think they're going to beat Philly in week 4, but it definitely could be a competitive ball game and a game where I think Lawrence could have 20 fantasy points in that one. So I would definitely pick him up this week. It doesn't mean you have to start him, but definitely a guy to stash on your roster, because after that, week 5 versus Houston, week 6 in Indy, week 7 versus the Giants, some pretty good matchups coming up in the next few weeks after that. And I would give Lawrence an ad this week. The next guy, Jameis Winston of the New Orleans Saints. So we know Winston's been banged up with the 4 fractures in his back here, but he's gone out there and he's still putting up some decent fantasy days, is Jameis Winston here. Week 1 at Atlanta, 269 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 9 rush yards, a 2-point conversion. Week 2 versus a tough Tampa Bay defense, we know he didn't do much, 236 passing, a touchdown, 3 intos, 2 rush yards. And then week 3 at Carolina, a lot of catch-up and garbage time. He threw for 353, a passing touchdown, 2 intos, 5 rush yards. So right here, week 4, in a London ball game, usually those ball games are shootouts, and we don't see a lot of defense in those ones. So right here, it's versus the Minnesota Vikings. Their secondary is definitely leaky. We know Goff didn't get 2 touchdowns in week 3 versus them, but he threw for 277 yards. We saw Hurts in week 2 have a big ball game versus the Vikings. So right here, I think Winston, he could have anywhere from 18 to 25 fantasy points here for fantasy owners if they need a streaming option or want to change a quarterback here in week 4. And right now, he's available in about 60% of fantasy leagues. The next quarterback's Marcus Mariota of the Atlanta Falcons. So Marcus Mariota, he's been a serviceable quarterback in the first 3 weeks of the season here. Right now, available in over 75% of fantasy leagues here is Mariota. Week 1 versus the Saints, 215 pass yards, 72 rush yards, a touchdown, a fumble loss. Week 2 with the Rams, 196 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 2 intos, 16 rush yards, a 2-point conversion. And week 3 at Seattle, 229 pass yards and into only 4 rushing yards, rushing touchdown, and a fumble loss. So right here, week 4, not the greatest matchup versus the Cleveland Browns, who obviously have a good pass rush. But right here, Mariota, he has some decent weapons in this offense. Cordell Patterson's been solid in 2 out of the first 3 ball games in the backfield. Kyle Pitts, we know he's a talented tight end, even though he got off to a slow start, but had a bounce-back game in week 3. And Drake London, I think he could win Rookie of the Year this season on the offense. And he scored another touchdown in week 3 at Seattle. So right here, week 4, definitely tough matchup versus Cleveland. But if these other guys aren't available in your fantasy leagues here, he's a guy I would give a chance to. And like I said, he had a decent matchup in Seattle, and he's gone 18 or more fantasy points so far in the first 3 weeks. And the fifth and final quarterback I look to get off the wire this week here is Geno Smith of the Seattle Seahawks. So believe it or not, Geno Smith, he's been pretty decent so far this season, even for fantasy purposes. Week 1 had a pretty good ball game versus Denver, 195 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, 14 rush yards. Week 2 at San Francisco, he got shut down, 197 pass yards, and didn't throw 2 rush yards. And then week 3 versus Atlanta, 325 pass yards, 2 touchdowns, and didn't throw. So right here, Geno's gone over 20 fantasy points 2 out of the last 3 times. And then we could see a mini shootout in week 4 at Detroit. It's an indoor game. He's got good weapons on offense with Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf. And Geno, he's definitely looked improved than he has over the last few seasons we've seen him in there. And even reports came out earlier last week that they're ready to let Geno cook. And in this ball game versus Atlanta, they gave him an opportunity. But it came down to crunch time. He threw a pick interception on the last drive of the game, and the Falcons clinched it. But right here, it has decent matchups coming up is Geno Smith. And he's a quarterback in deeper leagues I definitely will pick up. And he's available in 90% of fantasy leagues. That's a few quarterbacks I look to add on the wire here for week 4 of the fantasy football season.